A family built on vows and violence. Alessandra Romano had been raised to be untouchable. But when her family betrayed Dario Benedetti, she learned the truth. She was not untouchable. She was leverage. Dario traced a slow circle on the inside of her wrist, his voice dark with amusement. "Your father thought he could cheat me," he murmured. "Now you'll take his place." Chapter 1. The Price of Betrayal. The chill of the marble floor seeped through Alessandra's thin silk slippers, a stark contrast to the opulent surroundings of the Benedetti mansion. It had been 3 days since her father's hurried, hushed phone call, a call that had shattered the illusion of her carefully constructed world. 3 days since she'd been ripped from her life, her curated existence of charity galas and art exhibitions replaced by this gilded cage. She traced the intricate carvings of the antique writing desk in the room that was now hers, or rather, her prison. It was a beautiful room, undeniably. Rose-colored damask wallpaper, a 4-poster bed draped in ivory silk, a balcony overlooking a meticulously manicured garden that seemed to mock her confinement. But beauty couldn't mask the underlying truth. She was a hostage. A pawn in a game she didn't understand, played by men she barely knew. Her father, Antonio Romano, a man she'd always believed to be powerful, untouchable, had apparently made a grave error. He'd crossed Dario Benedetti. The details were hazy, whispered in fragments by the stone-faced guards who brought her meals trays laden with delicacies she couldn't stomach. Something about a shipment, a betrayal, a debt unpaid. The specifics didn't matter. The consequence was clear. Alessandra hugged herself, the fine cashmere of her sweater offering little warmth. She hadn't seen Dario Benedetti since that first, terrifying encounter. The memory of his eyes, dark and intense, sent a shiver down her spine. He hadn't shouted, hadn't threatened. His voice had been low, almost a purr, laced with a chilling amusement that was far more unsettling than any outburst. "Your father thought he could cheat me," he murmured. "Now you'll take his place." He traced a slow circle on the inside of her wrist, his touch surprisingly gentle, yet possessive. The gesture had been a blatant display of power, a reminder that she was his now, a possession to be controlled. The delicate gold bracelet she always wore, a gift from her late mother, felt suddenly heavy, a symbol of a life stolen. She walked to the window, the glass cool against her forehead. The garden below was bathed in the warm glow of the late afternoon sun. A gardener, an elderly man with a weathered face and kind eyes, was meticulously pruning the roses. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, his hands gentle as he coaxed the blooms to perfection. For a moment, Alessandra envied him. His world was contained within these walls, yet he seemed free in a way she was not. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she gripped the windowsill for support. She hadn't eaten properly in days, the fear and uncertainty churning in her stomach, stealing her appetite. She closed her eyes, trying to conjure her mother's face, her gentle smile, her soothing voice. Her mother, Isabella, had died 5 years ago, leaving a void in Alessandra's life that had never truly healed. Isabella had been the heart of their family, the quiet strength that balanced her father's ambition. "Be strong, Cara," her mother would have said. "Remember who you are." But who was she now? She was no longer Alessandra Romano, the socialite, the philanthropist, the art connoisseur. She was Alessandra Romano, the hostage, the daughter of a disgraced man, a bargaining chip. A sharp rap on the door startled her. She turned, her heart pounding. A young woman, perhaps in her early 20s, stood in the doorway. She was dressed in a simple black dress, her dark hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her eyes, a startling shade of green, held a mixture of curiosity and pity. "Signorina Romano," she said, her voice soft, with a slight Italian accent. "Signor Benedetti requests your presence at dinner." Alessandra's stomach clenched. Dinner. With him. She smoothed down her sweater, a futile attempt to regain some semblance of composure. Tell him, I'm not hungry." The young woman hesitated. "Signorina, it is not wise to refuse Signor Benedetti." Alessandra knew that. She'd learned that much in the past 3 days. Refusal was not an option. It was a challenge, and challenges were met with consequences. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing pulse. "Very well," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "I'll be down shortly." The young woman nodded and retreated, closing the door softly behind her. Alessandra looked around the room, her gilded cage, and a flicker of defiance ignited within her. She wouldn't break. She wouldn't let Dario Benedetti see her fear. She would face him, and she would survive this. She would find a way to reclaim her life, even if it meant playing his game for now. She would learn the rules, and then she would find a way to break them. She owed it to her father, to her mother, to herself. She would not be a victim. She would be a survivor. And perhaps, just perhaps, she could even find a way to turn the tables on the man who held her captive. The thought, however small, gave her a sliver of hope in the encroaching darkness. She had to believe there was light at the end. She just had to get there. It would not be easy, but it was possible. Tonight was another challenge. And the first step was getting downstairs. Chapter 2. Chains of Silk and Steel. The dining room was vast, echoing with the quiet clinking of silverware against porcelain. A long, mahogany table, polished to a mirror sheen, dominated the space. It could easily seat 20, but tonight, only 2 places were set, facing each other across an expanse of gleaming wood and flickering candlelight. The air was thick with the aroma of roasted meats and rich sauces, a stark contrast to the knot of apprehension twisting in Alessandra's stomach. Dario Benedetti was already seated at the head of the table, a figure of imposing elegance in a dark suit that seemed to absorb the light. He rose as she entered, a gesture of courtesy that felt more like a calculated display of power. His eyes, the same intense, unsettling dark as she remembered, scanned her from head to toe, a slow, deliberate assessment that made her skin crawl. "Alessandra," he said, his voice a low rumble that resonated through the room. "You look well." The word well was laced with an undercurrent of something she couldn't quite decipher: amusement, perhaps, or even approval. It was unnerving. She forced herself to meet his gaze, holding it with a defiance she didn't entirely feel. "Thank you," she replied, her voice cool and even. She took the seat opposite him, the heavy chair feeling like a throne of thorns. Servants, silent and efficient, moved around them, pouring wine, serving the first course, a delicate antipasto of marinated artichoke hearts and paper-thin slices of prosciutto. Alessandra picked at the food, her appetite non-existent. She watched Dario as he ate, his movements precise and controlled, his expression unreadable. He was undeniably handsome, in a dangerous, predatory way. His features were sharp and defined, his jawline strong, his hair dark and slightly silvered at the temples, giving him an air of distinguished ruthlessness. He looked to be in his late 40s, but his eyes held a timeless quality, hinting at a life lived on the edge, a life steeped in secrets and shadows. "Your father," he said, breaking the silence, "is a foolish man." Alessandra stiffened. "My father made a mistake." Dario chuckled, a low, humorless sound. "A mistake?"
"He stole from me, Alessandra."
"He betrayed a trust that has existed between our families for generations." "I know nothing of his business dealings," she said, her voice tight. He raised an eyebrow, a gesture of skepticism. "Really? You lived under his roof, enjoyed the fruits of his labor. You think you are somehow innocent in all of this?" "I am innocent of his crimes," she corrected him, emphasizing the last word. "I am not responsible for his actions." He leaned back in his chair, studying her with an intensity that made her want to squirm. "Perhaps not. But you are his daughter. And in our world, family is everything. Loyalty is everything. And betrayal has consequences." The candlelight flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls, making the room feel even more claustrophobic. Alessandra felt a surge of anger, mixed with a desperate sense of helplessness. She was trapped, caught in a web of ancient feuds and unspoken rules. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He smiled, a slow, predatory smile that sent a shiver down her spine. "I want what your father owes me, and since he is unavailable you will have to suffice." "I have nothing to offer you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. He leaned forward, his eyes locking with hers. "You have more to offer than you know, Alessandra. You have your beauty, your intelligence, your resilience. And you have your name. The Romano name still carries weight, even in disgrace. It can be useful." He reached across the table and took her hand, his touch surprisingly gentle, yet undeniably possessive. His fingers were long and strong, his skin warm against hers. She tried to pull away, but he held her fast. "Don't be afraid, Alessandra," he murmured, his voice a low, seductive purr. "I won't hurt you. Not unless you give me reason to." The threat hung in the air, unspoken but palpable. She looked into his eyes, trying to find some trace of humanity, some hint of compassion. But all she saw was darkness, a cold, calculating intelligence that chilled her to the bone. He released her hand, and she quickly withdrew it, as if burned. She felt a sudden urge to flee, to run from this room, from this house, from this man. But she knew she couldn't. She was his prisoner, his hostage, his pawn. "Eat," he said, gesturing to the food on her plate. "You need to keep up your strength." She forced herself to pick up her fork, her hand shaking slightly. She took a small bite of the artichoke, the taste turning to ash in her mouth. She knew this dinner was more than just a meal. It was a test, a game of wills. And she was determined to play it, to survive it, even if it meant swallowing her fear and pretending to be something she was not. She had to be strong, for herself, and for the hope, however slim, of one day escaping this gilded cage. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, punctuated only by the clinking of silverware and the distant, muffled sounds of the city outside. The night had just begun, and Alessandra knew that it would be a long and difficult one. She took a deep breath and took a sip of the wine, the ruby liquid swirling in the glass. She had to find a way to navigate this treacherous path, to find a way to survive, and maybe, just maybe, to find a way to turn the tables on her captor. The challenge was enormous, and it would only just start. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Benedetti Mansion. The days that followed settled into a strange, unsettling routine. Alessandra was confined to the Benedetti mansion, her movements restricted, her every action observed. She was treated with a chilling courtesy, the servants addressing her as Signorina Romano with a deference that felt mocking, given her circumstances. She had the run of the house, except for certain areas Dario studied, a wing of guest rooms that were perpetually locked, and, of course, the outside world. The young woman who had brought her the dinner invitation, Sophia, became her reluctant companion. Sophia was the housekeeper's niece, brought in to attend to Alessandra's needs. She was quiet and reserved, but Alessandra sensed a deep well of empathy beneath her guarded exterior. "He's not always like this," Sophia said one afternoon, as they sat in the garden, Alessandra attempting to sketch the intricate patterns of the rose bushes. Alessandra looked up, surprised. Sophia rarely spoke of Dario, and when she did, it was always with a careful neutrality. "Like what?" Alessandra asked, trying to keep her voice casual. Sophia hesitated, her gaze darting towards the house, as if afraid of being overheard. "He carries a heavy burden. The weight of the family, the responsibility it changes a man." Alessandra frowned. "What responsibility?" Sophia shrugged, her shoulders rising and falling in a gesture of helplessness. "The business. The family business. It's not easy. There are enemies everywhere. Rivals. Threats." Alessandra knew, of course, that the family business was not legitimate. It was the mafia, the Cosa Nostra, a world of whispered secrets and brutal violence. She'd always been shielded from it, her father carefully keeping her insulated from the darker aspects of his life. Now, she was thrust into the heart of it, a stranger in a strange land. "My father, he said he was protecting me," Alessandra said, her voice barely a whisper. Sophia nodded. "He probably was." But sometimes, the best intentions she trailed off, leaving the sentence unfinished. Alessandra returned to her sketch, her hand moving automatically, her mind racing. She was starting to piece together a picture of Dario Benedetti, a picture that was far more complex than the cold, ruthless captor she'd first encountered. He was a man burdened by responsibility, haunted by the past, trapped by the expectations of his family and his position. She found herself drawn to the library, a vast, dimly lit room filled with leather-bound books, ancient maps, and the scent of aged paper and beeswax. It was a sanctuary, a place where she could escape the oppressive atmosphere of the mansion and lose herself in the pages of history and literature. One evening, she discovered a hidden alcove behind a bookshelf, a small, secret room that seemed to have been untouched for decades. Dust motes danced in the shafts of moonlight that filtered through a narrow window. In the center of the room was a small, wooden desk, and on the desk, a single, leather-bound journal. Alessandra hesitated, her hand hovering over the journal. It felt wrong to intrude, to pry into someone else's secrets. But the curiosity was too strong to resist. She opened the journal, her heart pounding in her chest. The handwriting was elegant, but faded, the ink a pale sepia. The first entry was dated over 50 years ago. It was written by a woman named Isabella, the same name as her mother. Alessandra's breath caught in her throat. She began to read, her eyes scanning the pages, her mind reeling. The journal chronicled the life of a young woman, a woman who had been deeply in love with a man named Dario Benedetti. But this was not her Dario. This was his father. As she read, Alessandra uncovered a story of forbidden love, betrayal, and tragedy. Isabella had been promised to another man, a powerful capo from a rival family. But she had fallen in love with Dario's father, a man who was considered an enemy. Their love affair had been passionate and reckless, a dangerous game played in the shadows. The journal ended abruptly, the last entry unfinished. Alessandra closed the book, her hands trembling. She felt a profound connection to this woman, this Isabella, who had lived and loved and suffered in this very house, decades ago. She was a kindred spirit, and Alessandra felt that she was on the edge of understanding. A noise behind her startled her. She turned, her heart leaping into her throat. Dario Benedetti stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Alessandra swallowed, her mouth dry. "I was just exploring." He stepped into the alcove, his presence filling the small space. He looked at the journal in her hands, his eyes narrowing. "That is private," he said, his voice cold. Alessandra held his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "It's her story, isn't it?" "Isabella's." His expression flickered, a flicker of surprise, perhaps even pain. "How did you know?" "The same name as my mother," Alessandra said. "And the story. It's familiar." He took the journal from her, his fingers brushing against hers. He held the book gently, as if it were a fragile, precious thing. "She was my father's great love," he said, his voice softer now, tinged with a hint of sadness. "A love that was forbidden. A love that ended in tragedy." He closed his eyes for a moment, as the ghost of what he'd just spoken of hung thick between them.
"Some things," he said at long last, "are not meant to be."
Alessandra looked at him, seeing him in a new light. He was not just a captor, a villain. He was a man haunted by the past, a man carrying the weight of his family's history. And in that moment, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't expected to feel: empathy. Perhaps even understanding. She wondered if the same tragedy that befell his father might one day befall them. She suddenly did not want to know. Chapter 4. The Gardener and the Ghost. The old gardener, whose name Alessandra learned was Giovanni, became an unexpected source of solace. He worked in the gardens every day, tending to the roses, the herbs, and the ancient olive trees with a quiet devotion that bordered on reverence. He rarely spoke, but his presence was comforting, a reminder of the natural world that existed outside the walls of the Benedetti mansion. One morning, Alessandra found him pruning a climbing rose that had grown wild and tangled, its thorns snagging on the stone wall. She watched him for a moment, admiring his gentle touch, his ability to coax beauty from chaos. "They're beautiful," she said, gesturing to the roses. Giovanni looked up, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "They are like life, Signorina," he said, his voice raspy with age. "Full of thorns, but also full of beauty. You must be patient, you must be gentle, and you must know how to prune away the dead wood to let the new growth flourish." His words resonated with Alessandra, mirroring her own situation. She was surrounded by thorns, by the dangers and uncertainties of her captivity. But she also sensed the potential for new growth, for a transformation that could emerge from this difficult experience. "Did you know Isabella?" Alessandra asked, remembering the journal and the tragic story it contained. Giovanni's smile faded, replaced by a look of sadness.
"Ah, Signorina Isabella."
A beautiful woman, inside and out. She loved these gardens. She would spend hours here, reading, dreaming, waiting. "Waiting for him?" Alessandra asked, her voice barely a whisper. Giovanni nodded. For Don Benedetti, their love was a flame that burned bright, but it was also a dangerous flame. It consumed them both. He sighed, his gaze drifting towards the house, as if he could see the ghosts of the past lingering in the shadows. "This house, it holds many secrets, many sorrows. It has seen too much pain, too much heartbreak." Alessandra felt a chill run down her spine. She had sensed that from the moment she arrived, a feeling of unease, of something lurking beneath the surface of the opulent surroundings. "Do you believe in ghosts, Giovanni?" she asked, surprised by her own question. He smiled, a knowing smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "I believe in memories, Signorina. And memories can be as powerful as ghosts. They can haunt us, they can comfort us, they can shape who we are." He returned to his pruning, his movements slow and deliberate. Alessandra watched him, her mind filled with questions. She was beginning to understand that the Benedetti mansion was not just a house, it was a repository of memories, a place where the past was inextricably linked to the present. Later that day, she found herself drawn back to the hidden alcove, to Isabella's journal. She reread the entries, searching for clues, for some understanding of the woman who had shared her name and, perhaps, her fate. She discovered a passage that described a secret garden, a hidden oasis within the larger grounds of the mansion. Isabella wrote of a small, walled garden filled with fragrant herbs and flowers, a place where she and Dario's father would meet in secret. Alessandra was intrigued. She had explored the gardens extensively, but she had never found anything resembling the secret garden described in the journal. She decided to ask Giovanni about it. She found him near the olive trees, his hands stained with soil. "Giovanni," she said, "Isabella's journal, it mentions a secret garden. Do you know where it is?" Giovanni looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of surprise and something else. Hesitation? Warning? "The secret garden," he said slowly, "is a place of sorrow, Signorina. It is best left undisturbed." "But I want to see it," Alessandra insisted. "I want to understand." Giovanni hesitated for a moment longer, then sighed. "Very well," he said. "I will show you. But be warned, Signorina. Some doors are best left unopened. Some memories are best left buried." He led her through the gardens, past the manicured lawns and the formal flower beds, to a secluded corner of the property, hidden behind a thick hedge of overgrown yew trees. He pushed aside the branches, revealing a narrow opening in the wall. Alessandra stepped through the opening, and her breath caught in her throat. She found herself in a small, enclosed garden, a world apart from the rest of the estate. It was overgrown and neglected, the flowers choked with weeds, the stone fountain dry and cracked. But there was a wild, untamed beauty to it, a sense of peace and solitude that was both haunting and alluring, and the undeniable feeling that something terrible had once transpired right where she stood. It was a heavy, sad, knowing air. "This is it," Giovanni said, his voice barely a whisper. "This is where they met. This is where their love bloomed and where it died." Alessandra walked slowly through the garden, her fingers tracing the rough stone walls. She could almost feel Isabella's presence, her spirit lingering in the air, a whisper of love and loss. It was, at once, both the most beautiful and the saddest place she had ever been. Chapter 5. A Feast of Secrets and Lies. Dario had been away for a week, a trip to attend to business in Sicily. Sophia had informed her, her expression carefully neutral. Alessandra had felt a strange mixture of relief and something else during his absence. Relief at the respite from his intense scrutiny, his unsettling presence. But also a sense of unease, a feeling that she was adrift, untethered. He returned unexpectedly one evening, just as Alessandra was finishing a solitary dinner in the smaller, less formal dining room. She heard his footsteps, the firm, confident tread that she had come to recognize, and her heart began to pound. He entered the room, his eyes immediately finding hers. He was dressed in a dark suit, his face drawn and tired, but his gaze was as intense as ever. "Alessandra," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I trust you have been comfortable?" The word comfortable felt loaded, a reminder of her captivity, her lack of freedom. She forced herself to meet his gaze, holding it with a defiance she didn't entirely feel. "As comfortable as a prisoner can be," she replied, her voice cool and even. He raised an eyebrow, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. "You are not a prisoner, Alessandra. You are a guest. A valued guest. A guest who is not allowed to leave," she pointed out. He smiled, a slow, predatory smile that sent a shiver down her spine. "Patience, Alessandra. All in good time." He gestured to the table. "Join me. I've brought back some delicacies from Sicily. A taste of home." Servants appeared, as if by magic, clearing away her half-eaten meal and replacing it with an array of dishes: fresh seafood, pasta with a rich, fragrant sauce, a platter of cheeses and fruits. The aroma filled the room, tempting, yet unsettling. He poured them both wine, a deep, ruby-red wine that smelled of dark berries and spice. He raised his glass. "To new beginnings," he said, his eyes locking with hers. Alessandra hesitated, then raised her own glass, her hand trembling slightly. She took a sip of the wine, the taste both sweet and bitter on her tongue. They ate in silence for a while, the only sound the clinking of silverware against porcelain. Alessandra picked at the food, her appetite small, her mind racing. She was trying to decipher Dario's mood, to understand his intentions. "My father," she said, breaking the silence. "What have you heard from him?" Dario's expression hardened. "Your father is elusive. He has made things difficult." "Difficult for whom?" she asked, her voice sharp. "For you? Or for me?" He leaned back in his chair, studying her with an intensity that made her want to squirm. "For both of us, Alessandra. His actions have consequences. For him and for you." "What consequences?" she pressed, her fear growing. He smiled, a cold, humorless smile. "That depends on you, Alessandra. On your cooperation." He reached across the table and took her hand, his touch surprisingly gentle, yet undeniably possessive. His fingers were long and strong, his skin warm against hers. She tried to pull away, but he held her fast. "I need your help, Alessandra," he said, his voice low and seductive. "Your father has assets that I need to recover. Information that only he possesses. And you are the key." Alessandra's heart sank. She knew what he was asking, what he was demanding. He wanted her to betray her father, to help him recover whatever it was that Antonio Romano had stolen. "I can't," she said, her voice trembling. "I won't betray my father." He squeezed her hand, his grip tightening. "You will, Alessandra. You have no choice. Your father's life, your own freedom, it all depends on it." The threat hung in the air, unspoken but palpable. She looked into his eyes, trying to find some trace of humanity, some hint of compassion. But all she saw was darkness, a cold, calculating intelligence that chilled her to the bone. He released her hand, and she quickly withdrew it, as if burned. She felt a wave of despair wash over her. She was trapped, caught between two powerful men, her father and her captor. And she knew that whatever choice she made, it would have devastating consequences. The beautiful dinner was a facade, a carefully constructed illusion. The wine and food were mere props, meant to create a scene, a moment of pressure. Tonight was a turning point, and Alessandra did not yet know if she was strong enough. Chapter 6. Echoes of a Forgotten Life. The days following Dario's return were filled with a suffocating tension. He was constantly present, watching her, questioning her, probing for any weakness, any hint of information that might lead him to her father. He was like a predator circling its prey, patient, relentless, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. Alessandra found herself withdrawing, retreating into the sanctuary of the library, the hidden alcove, and the secret garden. These were her escapes, the places where she could breathe, where she could try to make sense of the chaos that had engulfed her life. She spent hours rereading Isabella's journal, searching for some clue, some insight that might help her navigate this treacherous path. She felt a growing connection to this woman, this ghost from the past, who had also been caught in a web of love and betrayal. One afternoon, she found a small, faded photograph tucked between the pages of the journal. It was a picture of Isabella, a young woman with dark, luminous eyes and a radiant smile. She was standing in the secret garden, her arm linked with a man whose face was partially obscured by shadow. But Alessandra recognized the strong jawline, the dark hair, the intense gaze. It was Dario's father. She stared at the photograph, her heart aching. She could see the love in Isabella's eyes, the happiness that had been so tragically cut short. And she wondered if she was destined to repeat the same mistakes, to fall for a man who was both captivating and dangerous. She began to have recurring dreams, vivid, unsettling dreams that blended the past and the present. She dreamt of Isabella, running through the gardens, her laughter echoing through the trees. She dreamt of Dario's father, his face both tender and cruel. And she dreamt of Dario, his eyes burning with a mixture of desire and darkness. One night, she dreamt that she was standing in the secret garden, surrounded by a swirling mist. She saw Isabella, her face pale and sorrowful, beckoning her forward. "Don't trust him," Isabella whispered, her voice a ghostly sigh. "Don't make the same mistake I did." Alessandra woke up with a start, her heart pounding, her body drenched in sweat. The dream had felt so real, so vivid, that she couldn't shake the feeling of unease. She decided to confide in Sophia, the only person in the mansion who seemed to offer any semblance of friendship. She found Sophia in the kitchen, helping the cook prepare the evening meal. "Sophia," she said, her voice hesitant, "I need to talk to you. About Dario." Sophia looked up, her expression wary. "Signorina, it is not wise, please," Alessandra interrupted. "I need to understand. I need to know, is he capable of love?" Sophia hesitated, her gaze darting towards the door, as if afraid of being overheard. "He was different once," she said softly. Before the tragedy. Before he became the capo." "What tragedy?" Alessandra asked, her voice barely a whisper. Sophia sighed, her shoulders slumping. "His brother, Marco. He was killed. In a feud with another family. It changed Dario. It hardened him. It made him ruthless." Alessandra felt a chill run down her spine. She remembered Dario's words about betrayal having consequences. She was beginning to understand the depth of his pain, the darkness that had consumed him. "He loved his brother," Sophia continued, her voice filled with sadness. "He would have done anything for him. And when he lost him, he lost a part of himself." Alessandra looked at Sophia, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and pity. She was starting to see Dario in a new light, not just as a captor, but as a man scarred by loss, haunted by the past. "Thank you, Sophia," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "For telling me." Sophia nodded, her expression somber. "Be careful, Signorina," she said. "Dario is a dangerous man. He is capable of great cruelty. But he is also capable of great love. And that can be even more dangerous. That love could destroy even the strongest of hearts, was the warning that lay, unspoken, between them." As Sophia returned to the food preparations, Alessandra knew she had to tread extremely carefully. She was dancing on a knife's edge, and she didn't know if she could keep her balance. Chapter 7. The Serpent's Bargain. Dario summoned Alessandra to his study, a room she had been forbidden to enter until now. It was a large, imposing space, lined with bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes. A massive desk, made of dark, polished wood, dominated the center of the room. The air was thick with the scent of old paper, cigar smoke, and something indefinable, a hint of danger and power. Dario was standing by the window, his back to her, looking out over the gardens. He turned as she entered, his eyes scanning her from head to toe, a slow, deliberate assessment that made her skin crawl. "Alessandra," he said, his voice a low rumble. "We need to talk." She stood stiffly, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, trying to maintain a semblance of composure. "About what?" He gestured to a chair in front of the desk.
"Seat."
She hesitated, then obeyed, the leather cool and smooth beneath her fingertips. She felt like a supplicant before a king, a pawn in a game she didn't understand. He walked around the desk and sat down opposite her, his eyes locking with hers. "I've made contact with your father," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. Alessandra's heart leaped with a mixture of hope and fear. Is he all right?" Dario smiled, a cold, humorless smile. "He's alive.
For now.
But his situation is precarious."
"What do you want?"
she asked, her voice trembling. He leaned forward, his gaze intense. "He has something that belongs to me, Alessandra. Information, documents, assets. And he's refusing to cooperate. He's testing my patience." "And you want me to convince him?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded. "You are his daughter. He loves you. He will listen to you." Alessandra felt a surge of anger, mixed with a desperate sense of helplessness. She was being used, manipulated, forced to betray the man who had always protected her. "I can't," she said, her voice shaking. "I won't betray my father." Dario's expression hardened. "You have no choice, Alessandra. Your father's life, your own freedom, it all depends on it. You will do as I say, or you will both suffer the consequences." He reached into a drawer and pulled out a small, velvet box. He opened it, revealing a delicate gold necklace with a single, teardrop-shaped emerald pendant. Alessandra's breath caught in her throat. She recognized the necklace. It had belonged to her mother. "Where did you get that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Dario smiled, a cruel, knowing smile. "Your father gave it to me, as a gesture of good faith. A promise of cooperation. A promise he has broken." He held the necklace up, the emerald glinting in the light. "This is a reminder, Alessandra. A reminder of what's at stake. Your father's loyalty, your mother's memory, your own future." He placed the necklace on the desk, between them. "You have 1 week, Alessandra. 1 week to convince your father to cooperate. 1 week to decide where your loyalties lie. With him or with me." He rose from his chair, his towering figure casting a shadow over her. "Choose wisely, Alessandra," he said, his voice a low, menacing whisper. "Your life and his depends on it." He left the room, leaving Alessandra alone with the necklace, the symbol of her mother's love and her father's betrayal. She felt a wave of despair wash over her, a feeling of being trapped, cornered, with no way out. She was caught in a serpent's bargain, a deal with the devil, and she knew that whatever choice she made, it would come at a terrible price. The weight of the world, or at least her world, was resting on her shoulders, and she did not know what to do. Chapter 8. Scars Beneath the Surface. The week that followed was a torment. Alessandra barely slept, barely ate, her mind consumed by the impossible choice Dario had forced upon her. She was torn between her loyalty to her father and her growing, conflicted feelings for her captor. She knew that betraying her father would be a devastating blow, a violation of the bond that had always defined her life. But she also knew that defying Dario could have dire consequences, not just for her father, but for herself. She tried to reach out to her father, sending coded messages through the few contacts she still had outside the mansion, but she received no response. She was alone, isolated, cut off from the world she knew. She found herself spending more and more time in the secret garden, seeking solace in the overgrown beauty, the echoes of Isabella's tragic love. She felt a kinship with this woman, this ghost from the past, who had also been caught between love and duty. One afternoon, she was sitting by the dry fountain, her head in her hands, when she heard a noise behind her. She turned, expecting to see Giovanni, but it was Dario. He stood there, his expression unreadable, his eyes dark and intense. He had changed his clothes. He was not wearing his usual dark, severe suit. He was in jeans and a simple, black t-shirt. It made him look younger, more human. "Alessandra," he said, his voice softer than usual. I wanted to see how you were." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and despair. "How do you think I am?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You've given me an impossible choice. You've threatened my father's life.
You've stolen my life."
He walked towards her, his movements slow and deliberate. He sat down beside her on the edge of the fountain, his proximity unsettling. "I know," he said, his voice low and regretful. "I know this is difficult, but I have no choice. Your father, he has crossed a line. He has betrayed a trust. And in our world, betrayal has consequences." "But why me?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Why involve me in this? I'm not a part of your world. I'm not a part of this." He reached out and touched her cheek, his fingers surprisingly gentle. She flinched at his touch, but she didn't pull away. "You are a part of it now, Alessandra," he said, his voice a husky whisper. "Whether you like it or not. You are your father's daughter, and you are important to me." The last sentence hung in the air, unspoken but palpable. Alessandra looked into his eyes, searching for some sign of deception, some hint of manipulation. But all she saw was vulnerability, a raw, unguarded emotion that she hadn't seen before. He took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. "I don't want to hurt you, Alessandra," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't want to hurt your father. But I need your help. I need you to trust me." Trust him? How could she trust him? He was her captor, her tormentor, the man who had turned her life upside down. And yet she felt a pull towards him, a connection that she couldn't deny. I don't know what to do," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He leaned closer, his breath warm on her face. "Do what your heart tells you, Alessandra," he said. "Listen to your instincts. And trust me. I will protect you. I will keep you safe." He leaned in and kissed her, his lips soft and gentle, yet possessive. It was a kiss of desperation, of longing, of a forbidden desire that had been simmering beneath the surface. Alessandra felt a wave of emotion wash over her, a mixture of fear, confusion, and something else. Something that felt dangerously close to desire. The scars beneath the surface, both his and hers, were beginning to show. And for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, they could heal each other. But could she ever fully give herself to a man, holding her hostage? Chapter 9. A dance on the edge of danger. The kiss changed everything. It shattered the carefully constructed walls Alessandra had built around herself, leaving her vulnerable, exposed, and utterly confused. She found herself drawn to Dario, drawn to his darkness, his intensity, his vulnerability. She knew it was dangerous, reckless, perhaps even foolish, but she couldn't deny the pull, the connection that had formed between them. Dario, too, seemed transformed. He was still the powerful, controlling capo, but there was a new gentleness in his touch, a new tenderness in his eyes. He began to spend more time with her, sharing meals, talking, even laughing. One evening, he took her to a small, secluded trattoria in a quiet corner of the city. It was a place he had frequented since he was a boy, he told her, a place where he could escape the pressures of his life, the expectations of his family. They sat at a small table, tucked away in a corner, the air filled with the aroma of garlic, oregano, and freshly baked bread. Dario ordered for them both, speaking to the waiter in rapid, fluent Italian. Alessandra watched him, fascinated by his effortless charm, his ability to command respect and affection. "You're different here," she said, as they waited for their food. "You're relaxed. More human." He smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "This is my escape, Alessandra," he said. "A place where I can be myself, where I can forget the burdens I carry." He reached across the table and took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. "I know I've put you through a lot, Alessandra," he said, his voice low and sincere. "I know I've been harsh, but I want you to know I'm not a monster." Alessandra looked into his eyes, searching for the truth. She saw pain, regret, and something else. Something that looked like love. "I know," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I see the man beneath the mask." Their food arrived, a simple but delicious meal of pasta with clams, grilled fish, and a crisp white wine. They ate in comfortable silence, the tension that had been so constant between them seeming to dissipate. After dinner, they walked along the waterfront, the city lights twinkling in the distance. The air was cool and fresh, a welcome change from the stuffy atmosphere of the mansion. Dario stopped, turning to face her. He took her hands in his gaze intense. "Alessandra," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "I am falling in love with you." The words hung in the air, unspoken but palpable. Alessandra's heart pounded in her chest. She had known, on some level, that this was happening, but to hear him say it was overwhelming. "Dario," she said, her voice trembling. I don't know what to say." He leaned in and kissed her, his lips soft and gentle, yet possessive. It was a kiss of longing, of desire, of a forbidden love that was blossoming in the midst of danger. Alessandra responded to the kiss, her arms wrapping around his neck, her body pressing against his. She felt a wave of passion wash over her, a passion that had been suppressed, denied, for so long. They stood there, embraced, under the starry sky, the city lights a distant backdrop to their intimate moment. It was a dance on the edge of danger, a love forged in the crucible of captivity. And Alessandra knew that she was playing with fire, that she was risking everything for a man who was both her captor and her lover. This was a moment in time, she felt.
And it would not last.
But she decided she would give in to the moment nonetheless. The consequences could be dealt with later. Right now, all that mattered was this. Chapter 10. The Lion and the Lamb. The relationship between Alessandra and Dario deepened, evolving into a complex tapestry of passion, tenderness, and unspoken fears. They were living a precarious existence, a fragile bubble of intimacy within the walls of the Benedetti mansion, a world away from the violence and betrayal that lurked just outside. Alessandra found herself falling deeper in love with Dario, drawn to his strength, his vulnerability, his hidden depths. She saw the man beneath the mask, the man who had been scarred by loss and burdened by responsibility. She saw his kindness, his generosity, his capacity for love. But she also saw the darkness, the ruthlessness, the cold calculation that were integral parts of his personality. She knew that he was a dangerous man, a man capable of great cruelty. And she knew that she was playing with fire, that their love was a forbidden flame that could easily consume them both. Dario, too, was deeply affected by their relationship. He had never known a woman like Alessandra, a woman who challenged him, who saw through his defenses, who accepted him for who he was, flaws and all. She was a breath of fresh air in his suffocating world, a ray of light in the darkness. He found himself wanting to protect her, to shield her from the dangers of his life, the violence that was his constant companion. He knew that he was putting her at risk, that their love was a dangerous game, but he couldn't resist the pull, the connection that had formed between them. One evening, they were sitting in the library, Alessandra reading, Dario working at his desk. The silence was comfortable, punctuated only by the crackling of the fire in the hearth and the turning of pages. Alessandra looked up from her book, her eyes meeting Dario's across the room. She saw a flicker of sadness in his gaze, a hint of the burden he carried. "What is it?" she asked, her voice soft. He sighed, running a hand through his hair.
"I'm worried," he said.
"About your father?" He's not responding to my messages. He's making things difficult. Alessandra felt a pang of guilt. She still hadn't been able to bring herself to betray her father, to give Dario the information he wanted. She was torn between her loyalty to her family and her love for Dario. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He rose from his desk and walked over to her, kneeling beside her chair. He took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. "Don't be," he said, his voice gentle. "I understand. It's a difficult situation. But I need you to try, Alessandra. For both of us." She looked into his eyes, searching for the truth. She saw love, desperation, and a hint of fear. "I'll try," she said, her voice trembling. "I promise." He leaned in and kissed her, his lips soft and tender, yet possessive. It was a kiss of reassurance, of a shared burden, of a love that was both fragile and strong. Later that night, as they lay in bed, wrapped in each other's arms, Alessandra couldn't shake the feeling of unease. She knew that their idyllic bubble was about to burst, that the outside world, with its dangers and betrayals, was closing in. It felt as though the forces of their two very different worlds were colliding, pushing them together, yet also threatening to tear them apart. She was the lamb, and he was the lion. And although they lay together peacefully now, she was all too aware of the potential dangers. The lion might protect the lamb, but it might just as easily devour it, too.
She just did not know which way this would go.
And it terrified her. Chapter 11. Cracks in the Armor. The fragile peace that Alessandra and Dario had found began to unravel. The pressure from Dario's famiglia, the demands of his business, and the looming threat of her father's silence created cracks in the armor of their relationship. Dario became more withdrawn, more distant, his mood fluctuating between tenderness and a cold, detached ruthlessness. He spent long hours in his study, the door locked, his conversations hushed and secretive. Alessandra felt him slipping away, retreating back into the darkness that had always been a part of him. One evening, she found him standing on the balcony, staring out at the city lights, his face etched with worry. She approached him cautiously, her hand reaching out to touch his arm. "Dario," she said softly, "what's wrong?" He turned to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and despair. "It's complicated," he said, his voice tight. "There are problems. Threats." "From whom?" she asked, her heart pounding with fear. He hesitated, his gaze darting away. "From rivals. Enemies. People who want what I have. People who want to hurt me." Alessandra felt a chill run down her spine. She knew that Dario's life was filled with danger, but she had always tried to push it to the back of her mind, to focus on the man she loved, not the world he inhabited. "Can't you get out?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Can't you just leave it all behind?" He chuckled, a low, humorless sound. "It's not that simple, Alessandra," he said. "This is my life. This is my family. This is my destiny. I can't just walk away." He turned back to the city, his silhouette outlined against the glittering lights. "I was born into this, Alessandra," he said, his voice filled with a weary resignation. "I had no choice. This is the only life I've ever known." Alessandra felt a wave of sadness wash over her. She understood, on some level, the constraints that bound him, the ties of loyalty and obligation that held him captive. But she also knew that she couldn't live in this world of violence and fear. "But what about us?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What about our future?" He turned to her, his eyes searching hers. "I don't know, Alessandra," he said, his voice honest. "I don't know if we have a future. This life, it consumes everything. It leaves no room for happiness, for love." His words were like a knife to her heart. She had known, deep down, that their love was a fragile thing, a dream that could easily be shattered. But to hear him say it, it was devastating. She stepped away from him, her body trembling. "So, what?" she asked, her voice rising. "You're just going to give up? You're just going to let this life destroy us?" He reached out to her, but she recoiled, her eyes filling with tears. "Don't touch me," she said, her voice breaking. Don't pretend that everything is alright.
It's not alright.
It's never been alright. She turned and ran, fleeing from the balcony, from Dario, from the suffocating weight of his world. She ran through the mansion, her footsteps echoing in the empty corridors, until she reached the secret garden. She collapsed onto the overgrown grass, her body shaking with sobs. She felt lost, betrayed, and utterly alone. The dream she had allowed herself to believe in, the dream of a future with Dario, was crumbling before her eyes. The cracks were becoming chasms, and she was falling. She did not think she could get back up. This was the end, and a horrible new beginning. And neither were good. Chapter 12. Letters from a Stranger. Alessandra avoided Dario for days, retreating into the silence of her room, the library, and the secret garden. She felt numb, heartbroken, and utterly lost. The fragile bubble of their love had burst, and she was left with the harsh reality of his world, a world she could never truly be a part of. One morning, Sophia brought her a letter, her expression hesitant and concerned. "This arrived for you, Signorina Romano," she said. "It has no return address." Alessandra took the letter, her heart pounding. She recognized the handwriting on the envelope. It was her father's. She tore open the envelope, her hands trembling. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in her father's familiar scrawl. "Alessandra, mia cara, I know I've put you in a terrible position. I am sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen. I thought I was protecting you, but I was wrong. I have made mistakes, terrible mistakes, and now you are paying the price. Dario Benedetti is a dangerous man, Alessandra. He is not to be trusted. He will use you, manipulate you, and then he will discard you. You must get out, cara. You must escape before it is too late. I have arranged for your escape. There is a man, a friend, who will help you. He will be waiting for you at the old church in the Piazza Navona tomorrow night at midnight. He will have a boat waiting to take you away from this place, away from Benedetti. Do not tell anyone, Alessandra. Not even Sophia. Trust no one but this man. He will have a code phrase, Stella Maris. He will say this, and you will know it is him. He will bring your freedom. I love you, cara. I always have. And I pray that one day we will be together again. Your father." Alessandra read the letter again and again, her mind reeling. Her father was alive, and he had arranged for her escape. But could she trust him? Could she trust this stranger he had sent to help her? And what about Dario? Could she just leave him, without a word? She was torn between her loyalty to her father and her love for Dario. She knew that leaving would be a betrayal, a final severing of the ties that had bound them together. But she also knew that staying could be even more dangerous, that she was risking her life, her soul, by remaining in his world. She spent the rest of the day in a state of turmoil, wrestling with her decision. She paced the floor of her room, her mind racing, her heart aching. As evening approached, she made her decision. She would go. She would meet this stranger, this Stella Maris, and she would escape. She owed it to her father, to herself, to have a chance at a life free from fear, free from the suffocating weight of the Benedetti world. But as she prepared to leave, she couldn't shake the feeling of sadness, of loss. She was leaving behind the man she loved, the man who had shown her both darkness and light. She was leaving behind a part of herself. She wrote a short note to Dario, her hand trembling as she wrote the words. "Dario, I have to go. I can't explain, but I have to leave. I'm sorry. I will never forget you. Alessandra." She placed the note on his pillow, where he would find it when he returned to their room. She took one last look around the room that had been both her prison and her sanctuary. And then, with a heavy heart, she slipped out into the night. This was the right decision, she told herself. But it sure didn't feel like it. Chapter 13. The Weight of Loyalty. The Piazza Navona was alive with activity, even at this late hour. Street performers, artists, and tourists mingled under the glow of the ancient fountains, their voices and laughter echoing through the square. Alessandra felt a pang of longing for her former life, A life of carefree anonymity, a life before she had been thrust into the dangerous world of the mafia. She scanned the faces in the crowd, searching for the man who would be her savior, the man who would utter the code phrase, Stella Maris. Her heart pounded in her chest, a mixture of fear and anticipation. She was taking a huge risk, trusting a complete stranger, but she had no other choice. She spotted a man standing near the Fontana dei Quattro Fiumi, his eyes scanning the crowd. He was tall and lean, with dark hair and a weathered face. He looked capable and dangerous. She approached him cautiously, her hand clutching the small bag that contained her few belongings. "Excuse me," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Are you waiting for someone?" The man turned to her, his eyes narrowing. He studied her for a moment, his gaze intense and unwavering. "Perhaps," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "It depends. Are you Alessandra Romano?" Alessandra nodded, her heart leaping into her throat. "Yes," she said. "I am." The man smiled, a brief, fleeting smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Stella Maris," he said, uttering the code phrase that was her key to freedom. Alessandra felt a wave of relief wash over her. This was him. This was the man her father had sent to rescue her. "Come," he said, taking her arm. "We must hurry. We don't have much time." He led her through the crowded square, his pace brisk and purposeful. They reached a narrow side street, where a dark car was waiting, its engine idling. "Get in," he said, opening the rear door. Alessandra hesitated for a moment, her gaze lingering on the Piazza Navona, on the life she was leaving behind. She thought of Dario, of his face, his touch, his voice. She felt a pang of regret, a sharp, agonizing pain that threatened to overwhelm her. But she knew she couldn't stay. She had made her decision. She had to escape, to reclaim her life, even if it meant leaving behind the man she loved. She climbed into the car, the door closing behind her with a thud. The man got in beside her, and the car sped off, disappearing into the labyrinthine streets of Rome. As they drove, Alessandra couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Something felt wrong. The man's silence, his cold demeanor, the way he avoided her gaze, it all added up to a sense of foreboding. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice trembling. The man didn't answer. He just kept driving, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Alessandra's fear grew. She began to suspect that she had made a terrible mistake, that she had trusted the wrong person. Suddenly, the car screeched to a halt. They were in a dark, deserted alleyway, the buildings looming over them like menacing shadows. The man turned to her, his eyes glinting in the darkness. "Get out," he said, his voice cold and menacing. Alessandra's heart pounded in her chest. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was not her father's friend. This was someone else. Someone dangerous. Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The man smiled, a cruel, knowing smile. "I'm a friend of Dario's," he said. "He sends his regards." Alessandra's blood ran cold. Dario. He had found her. He had anticipated her escape. And he had sent this man, not to rescue her, but to what? "He knew I would try to leave, didn't he?" She barely mouthed the question. He gave a curt nod, and that simple movement told Alessandra everything. She was truly his, now more than ever. The weight of loyalty, both hers and his, was a heavy burden, and it was about to crush her. Chapter 14. A glimpse of freedom. Two men emerged from the shadows, their faces hard and expressionless. They grabbed Alessandra, their grip rough and unyielding. She struggled, fighting against them, but they were too strong. "Let me go," she cried, her voice filled with terror. "What are you doing?" The man who had driven the car, the one who had uttered the false code phrase, smiled cruelly. "Dario wants you back, Alessandra," he said. "He doesn't like it when his possessions try to run away." They dragged her towards a nearby building, a warehouse or a factory, its windows dark and empty. Alessandra's mind raced, desperately searching for a way to escape. But she knew it was hopeless. She was trapped, caught in Dario's web, and there was no way out. They pushed her through a heavy metal door into a dimly lit room. The air was thick with the smell of dust and decay. There was a single chair in the center of the room and a bare light bulb hanging from the ceiling. They forced her into the chair, tying her hands and feet with rough rope. She winced in pain as the rope cut into her skin. The man who had driven the car stood before her, his eyes cold and menacing.
Dario will be here soon, he said.
He has some questions for you. Alessandra's heart sank. She knew what those questions would entail. She had seen the darkness in Dario's eyes, the ruthlessness that lurked beneath the surface. She had betrayed him, and now she would pay the price. She closed her eyes, trying to compose herself, trying to find some inner strength to face what was coming. She thought of her father, of her mother, of the life she had lost. She thought of Dario, of the love they had shared, the love that had turned into a twisted, possessive obsession. Hours passed, or perhaps it was only minutes. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the suffocating darkness of the room. Alessandra waited, her body aching, her mind numb with fear. Suddenly, she heard the sound of footsteps, the heavy tread that she recognized.
Dario.
He was here. The door opened, and he stood there, his silhouette outlined against the dim light. He looked different. His face was pale and drawn, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger, betrayal, and something else. Something that looked like pain. He walked towards her, his movements slow and deliberate. He stopped in front of her, his gaze intense and unwavering. Alessandra, he said, his voice low and husky.
Why?
The single word hung in the air, heavy with accusation and regret. Alessandra looked at him, her eyes filling with tears. I had to, she said, her voice trembling.
I had to try.
I can't live like this, Dario. I can't live in your world. He reached out and touched her cheek, his fingers surprisingly gentle. She flinched at his touch, but she didn't pull away. You betrayed me, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You tried to run away. And you lied to me, she said. You sent your man, posing as my salvation. You knew I would go. He sighed. I had to know, Alessandra, he replied. I had to know if you truly wanted to leave. And now you know, she whispered. He knelt before her, his eyes level with hers. I love you, Alessandra, he said, his voice raw with emotion. I know I've hurt you. I know I've made mistakes. But I can't let you go. He leaned in and kissed her, his lips soft and gentle, yet possessive. It was a kiss of desperation, of longing, of a love that was both a blessing and a curse. Alessandra responded to the kiss, her body trembling. She felt a wave of conflicting emotions wash over her love, fear, anger, and a flicker of hope. He pulled away, his eyes searching hers. I'll make it right, Alessandra, he said. I promise.
I'll change.
I'll find a way for us to be together. Without all this darkness. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that he could change, that they could have a future together. But she knew, deep down, that it was a lie. He was a capo, a man of violence, a man trapped by his own destiny. And she was a prisoner of his love. The glimpse of freedom she had tasted was gone, perhaps forever. She was back where she started. Only worse, because now her heart was truly broken. Chapter 15. The storm breaks. Dario kept Alessandra close, closer than ever before. He untied her, brought her back to the mansion, but the atmosphere had shifted. The pretense of normalcy was gone, replaced by a palpable tension, a constant awareness of the precariousness of their situation. He was like a hawk, watching her every move, his possessiveness both a comfort and a suffocating cage. He tried to make amends, showering her with gifts, apologies, and promises. He swore he would find a way out, a way for them to be together without the shadow of the mafia looming over them. But Alessandra saw the doubt in his eyes, the fear that he couldn't escape his own destiny. One evening, Dario received a phone call. Alessandra watched him as he spoke, his face growing increasingly pale, his voice tight with anger. He hung up the phone, his hands trembling.
What is it?
Alessandra asked, her heart pounding with dread. He turned to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "It's my cousin Ricardo," he said. He's making a move. He's challenging my authority. He's threatening war." Alessandra knew that Ricardo was a rival, a constant threat to Dario's power. She had heard whispers of his ruthlessness, his ambition, his desire to overthrow Dario and take control of the Famiglia. "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Dario looked at her, his gaze intense. "I have to fight," he said. "I have no choice. This is my life, Alessandra. This is my responsibility. I have to protect my family, our future." He reached out and took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. "I need you to be strong, Alessandra," he said. "I need you to be brave. This is going to be difficult. But I promise you, I will protect you. I will keep you safe." She nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She knew that she was standing on the precipice of a storm that could consume them both. The following days were filled with a frantic energy. The mansion became a fortress, armed guards patrolling the grounds, whispers of meetings and plans filling the air. Dario was constantly on the move, meeting with his lieutenants, strategizing, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. Alessandra felt like a ghost, drifting through the mansion, watching the preparations for war, her heart heavy with dread. She knew that she was caught in the middle of a power struggle, a battle between two ruthless men, and she had no control over her own fate. One night, Dario came to her room, his face drawn and tired. He sat beside her on the bed, taking her hands in his. "I've made arrangements," he said, his voice low and serious. "I'm sending you away. To a safe place. Somewhere Ricardo can't reach you." Alessandra's heart sank. She had known deep down that this was coming. But to hear him say it was like a death sentence. "No," she said, her voice trembling. "I won't leave you. I won't abandon you." He squeezed her hands, his grip tightening. "You have to, Alessandra," he said. "It's too dangerous. I can't protect you here. I need to know that you're safe." "But what about us?" she asked, her voice breaking. "What about our future?" He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and despair. "I don't know, Alessandra," he said. "I don't know what the future holds. But I promise you, if I survive this, I will find you. I will come for you." He leaned in and kissed her, his lips soft and gentle, yet possessive. It was a kiss of goodbye, a farewell to the dream they had shared, a dream that was now being torn apart by the violence of his world. Tears streamed down Alessandra's face as she clung to him, her body shaking with sobs. She knew that this might be the last time she ever saw him. The storm had broken, and she was being swept away by the raging winds. She was leaving, perhaps forever, the only man she had ever truly loved. Her glimpse of freedom had been an illusion, and now a different type of freedom beckoned. But it was a freedom without him, and she did not know if she could bear it. Chapter 16. Blood and Water. Alessandra was taken to a secluded villa on the coast, a beautiful, isolated place surrounded by olive groves and overlooking the turquoise waters of the Mediterranean. It was a paradise, but it felt like a prison. She was guarded by two of Dario's most trusted men, loyal soldiers who treated her with respect, but also with a firm, unwavering authority. She was safe, but she was not free. She spent her days wandering the grounds, staring out at the sea, her heart aching for Dario. She had no news of him, no way of knowing what was happening in Rome, in the war that was raging between him and Ricardo. The silence was deafening, the uncertainty unbearable. One evening, she was sitting on the terrace, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, when one of the guards approached her. "Signorina Romano," he said, his voice hesitant. "There is news." Alessandra's heart leaped into her throat. "What is it?" she asked, her voice trembling. Is he all right?" The guard hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor.
"There was a battle," he said.
"In Rome. Many men were killed." Alessandra's blood ran cold.
"Dario?"
she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What about Dario?" The guard looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and something else. Something that looked like relief? Signor Benedetti, he is alive, he said. But he is wounded. Seriously wounded. Alessandra felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. She gripped the railing of the terrace, her knuckles turning white. Where is he? She asked, her voice shaking. I need to see him. I need to be with him. The guard shook his head. It is not possible, Signorina, he said. It is too dangerous. Ricardo's men are still searching for him.
They're searching for you.
Alessandra felt a surge of anger, mixed with a desperate sense of helplessness. She couldn't just sit here, waiting, while Dario was fighting for his life. She had to do something. I don't care about the danger, she said, her voice rising. I need to see him. I need to be with him.
You have to take me to him.
The guard hesitated, his loyalty to Dario warring with his concern for her safety. Signorina, I cannot disobey orders. Alessandra stared at him, her eyes filled with determination.
Then I will go alone, she said.
I will find him myself. She turned and ran, fleeing from the terrace, from the villa, from the guards who were supposed to protect her. She ran towards the sea, towards the small fishing village that nestled in the cove below. She knew it was reckless, dangerous, perhaps even foolish, but she didn't care. She had to see Dario. She had to be with him. She had to know if he was alive. She reached the village, her lungs burning, her legs aching. She found a fisherman, an old man with weathered face and kind eyes. She pleaded with him, begging him to take her to Rome, to help her find Dario. The old man looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and understanding. He had seen the darkness of the mafia, the violence that it brought, the lives that it destroyed. I will help you, Signorina, he said, his voice raspy with age. But be warned, the sea is rough tonight, and the journey it will be dangerous. He glanced at the waters, choppy and ominous. Alessandra nodded, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination.
I don't care, she said. I have to go.
She climbed into his small fishing boat, the wood creaking beneath her feet. The old man started the engine, and the boat chugged out of the cove, heading towards the open sea, towards Rome, towards the man she loved, towards the uncertain future that awaited them. The blood that had been spilled, and the water they were about to cross, were both treacherous. And Alessandra did not know if she would survive either. But she had to try. Chapter 17. The Unseen Enemy. The journey to Rome was a nightmare. The sea was rough, the waves crashing against the small fishing boat, tossing it around like a toy. Alessandra clung to the railing, her body soaked with seawater, her stomach churning with nausea. The old fisherman, his face grim and determined, steered the boat through the storm, his eyes fixed on the distant lights of the city. Alessandra prayed for Dario's safety, prayed for their reunion, prayed for a future that seemed increasingly impossible. She thought of their time together, the moments of tenderness, the passionate kisses, the shared dreams that had been shattered by the violence of his world. After what seemed like an eternity, they reached the outskirts of Rome. The old fisherman guided the boat into a hidden cove, a place where he had often smuggled goods and people in the past. We are here, Signorina, he said, his voice low and cautious. But be careful. The city is crawling with Ricardo's men. They're looking for you and for Don Benedetti. Alessandra thanked him, her heart filled with gratitude. She gave him all the money she had, a small token of appreciation for his bravery and his kindness. She stepped onto the shore, her legs shaky, her body aching. She was alone, in a city that had become a battleground, a city where danger lurked around every corner. She knew she had to find Dario, but she had no idea where to start. She had no contacts, no friends, no one she could trust. She was a stranger in a strange land, hunted by both Ricardo's men and, potentially, by Dario's own famiglia, who might see her as a liability. She began to walk, following the coastline, her eyes scanning the shadows, her ears alert to any sound. She avoided the main streets, sticking to the narrow alleyways, the hidden passages, the forgotten corners of the city. She came across a small, run-down church, its doors open, a faint light flickering inside. She hesitated, then entered, seeking sanctuary, seeking some guidance, some sign of hope. The church was empty, except for an old priest, kneeling before the altar, his head bowed in prayer. Alessandra approached him cautiously, her footsteps echoing in the silence. "Father," she said, her voice trembling, "I need help." The priest looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of surprise and concern. He saw her disheveled appearance, her frightened eyes, her desperate plea. "What is it, my child?" he asked, his voice gentle and soothing. Alessandra told him her story, her voice breaking with emotion. She told him about Dario, about Ricardo, about the war that was tearing apart the city. She told him about her escape, her journey, her desperate search for the man she loved. The priest listened patiently, his expression compassionate. He had seen the darkness of the mafia, the toll it took on lives, the innocent victims caught in its web. "I know where he is," the priest said, his voice low and serious.
Dario.
"He is hiding in a safe house, a place known only to a few." Alessandra's heart leaped with hope. "Can you take me to him?" she asked, her voice pleading. The priest hesitated. "It is dangerous, my child," he said. "Ricardo's men are everywhere. They're searching for him and for you." "I don't care about the danger," Alessandra said, her voice firm. "I need to see him. I need to be with him." The priest nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. "Very well," he said. "I will help you. But we must be careful. We must be discreet. We must trust no one." He knew more than he was saying. The unseen enemy was not just Ricardo. It was also within Dario's own ranks. And he prayed they would make it before it was too late. He knew that time was running out. Chapter 18. Reclaiming the Past. The priest led Alessandra through a labyrinth of backstreets and hidden alleyways, avoiding the main thoroughfares and the watchful eyes of Ricardo's men. They moved like shadows, blending into the darkness, their footsteps silent on the cobblestones. Alessandra's heart pounded in her chest, a mixture of fear and anticipation. She was so close to seeing Dario, to knowing if he was alive, if he was safe. Finally, they reached a nondescript building, a crumbling apartment block in a forgotten corner of the city. The priest led her up a flight of rickety stairs to a door on the third floor. He knocked, a specific pattern of raps, a code. The door opened a crack, and a pair of wary eyes peered out. The priest spoke in hushed tones, exchanging words that Alessandra couldn't understand. The door opened wider, and they were ushered inside. The apartment was small and sparsely furnished, but it was clean and safe. A single lamp cast a warm glow, illuminating the room. And there, lying on a narrow bed, his face pale and bandaged, was Dario. Alessandra rushed to his side, her heart overflowing with emotion.
"Dario,"
she cried, her voice choked with sobs. "Oh, Dario, you're alive." He opened his eyes, his gaze weak, but filled with recognition. "Alessandra," he whispered, his voice hoarse. You came." She knelt beside him, taking his hand, her fingers interlacing with his. His skin was warm, his pulse weak, but steady. She felt a wave of relief wash over her, a profound sense of gratitude that he was still alive. "I had to," she said, her voice trembling. "I had to see you. I had to be with you." He smiled, a faint, fleeting smile that reached his eyes. "You're reckless," he whispered. "Brave and reckless." He closed his eyes, his breathing shallow and labored. Alessandra stayed with him, holding his hand, whispering words of comfort, of love, of hope. The priest and the man who had opened the door watched them, their expressions somber. They knew that Dario was still in danger, that Ricardo's men were closing in, that their sanctuary was precarious. "We must move him," the priest said, his voice low and urgent. "It's not safe here. They will find him." The other man nodded. "I have a place," he said. "A place where he will be safe. A place where he can recover." Alessandra looked at them, her eyes filled with determination. "I'm going with him," she said. "I won't leave him." They hesitated, knowing the risks, but they also saw the unwavering love in her eyes, the fierce loyalty that bound her to Dario. "Very well," the priest said. But we must hurry. We must leave now. They carefully lifted Dario from the bed, supporting his injured body. They moved him through the darkness, through the hidden passages of the city, towards a new sanctuary, a new hope. As they moved, Alessandra thought of Isabella, of the secret garden, of the tragic love that had blossomed and died within the walls of the Benedetti mansion. She realized that she was reclaiming the past, rewriting the story, forging a new path for herself and for Dario. She was no longer a hostage, a pawn, a victim. She was a woman in love, a woman fighting for her future, a woman determined to break free from the chains of the past. And as she held Dario's hand, as she whispered words of encouragement, she knew that they would face the future together, whatever it may hold. The reclaiming of her past also meant reclaiming herself. And she would not let that go, no matter the cost. Chapter 19. A Love Forged in Fire. The safe house was a small, isolated farmhouse, nestled in the hills outside Rome. It was a world away from the violence and chaos of the city, a place of peace and tranquility, surrounded by vineyards and olive groves. Here, Dario slowly began to recover, his body mending, his spirit strengthened by Alessandra's unwavering love and care. She tended to his wounds, cooked his meals, read to him, and talked to him, sharing her dreams, her fears, her hopes for a future that seemed increasingly uncertain. She was his nurse, his companion, his lover, his anchor in a world that had been torn apart by violence and betrayal. Dario watched her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude, admiration, and a growing sense of wonder. He had never known a woman like Alessandra, a woman who had faced such danger, such adversity, and yet remained so strong, so compassionate, so full of love. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, Dario spoke, his voice still weak, but filled with emotion. "Alessandra," he said, "you saved my life. You risked everything for me. You showed me what true love really means." She smiled, her eyes meeting his. "And you, Dario," she said, "you showed me that even in the darkest of hearts, there can be light. You showed me that even in the midst of violence and betrayal, there can be love." He reached out and took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. "I want to leave this life behind, Alessandra," he said. "I want to start over. With you. Somewhere far away from here. Somewhere where we can be free." Alessandra's heart leaped with hope. She had dreamed of this, prayed for this, but she had never truly believed it was possible. "Do you mean it?" she asked, her voice trembling. He nodded, his gaze intense. "I've never been more serious in my life," he said. "I've lost too much, Alessandra. I've seen too much darkness. I want a different life. A life with you." He told her his plan, a plan to disappear, to fake his own death, to sever all ties with the famiglia, to start a new life under a new identity, somewhere far away from the reach of Riccardo and the Mafia. It was a dangerous plan, a reckless plan, but it was also their only chance at happiness, their only chance at a future together. Alessandra agreed, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and excitement. She knew that they were taking a huge risk, that they were walking a tightrope between life and death, but she was willing to do it, for Dario, for their love, for the promise of a new beginning. They spent the next few days making preparations, gathering supplies, arranging for false documents, planning their escape. They worked together, their love a bond that strengthened them, a fire that forged them into a single, unbreakable unit. On the night of their departure, they stood on the porch of the farmhouse, looking out at the starry sky. The air was cool and crisp, the silence broken only by the chirping of crickets. Dario turned to Alessandra, his eyes filled with love and determination. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice low and husky. She nodded, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement. "Yes," she said. "I'm ready." He leaned in and kissed her, his lips soft and gentle, yet possessive. It was a kiss of farewell to the past, a kiss of hope for the future, a kiss of a love forged in fire, a love that had survived betrayal, violence, and the seemingly insurmountable obstacles of their two very different worlds. They turned and walked away from the farmhouse, disappearing into the darkness, towards a new life, a new beginning, a future that was uncertain, but filled with the promise of freedom and the enduring power of their love. Their love was forged by all they had been through, and it would endure anything that came next. They were sure of it. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and loyalties. The plan was audacious, bordering on suicidal. Dario, with Alessandra's help, would stage his own death, making it appear as though Ricardo's men had finally succeeded in their hunt. This would allow them to disappear, to assume new identities and escape the relentless grip of the mafia. But it required meticulous planning, perfect timing, and a healthy dose of luck. The key was to make it believable. Dario, with his intimate knowledge of the Famiglia's operations and Ricardo's methods, crafted a scenario that would play on Ricardo's paranoia and ambition. They would use a secluded location, a known meeting point for clandestine deals, and leave behind enough evidence to convince even the most skeptical observer. Alessandra, despite her initial fear, became an active participant in the planning. Her insights into Dario's world, her understanding of his character, and her own growing resourcefulness proved invaluable. She was no longer the naive socialite who had been thrust into this world. She was a woman forged by fire, a survivor, a partner. The night of the execution arrived, cold and clear. The chosen location was an abandoned warehouse near the docks, a place steeped in the city's history of illicit trade and violence. Dario, with the help of a trusted contact within the police force, a man who owed him a considerable debt, had arranged for a body double, a recently deceased man whose physical characteristics matched his own. Alessandra, her heart pounding in her chest, waited in a nearby safe house, a small apartment overlooking the docks. She watched through binoculars, her hands trembling, as Dario arrived at the warehouse alone. He was playing the role of a desperate man, cornered and ready to make a final stand. Minutes later, a car screeched to a halt outside the warehouse. Several men, Ricardo's henchmen, emerged, their faces grim and determined. They entered the warehouse, their weapons drawn. Alessandra held her breath, her eyes glued to the binoculars. She heard the muffled sounds of shouting, followed by a series of gunshots. Then, silence. After what seemed like an eternity, the men emerged from the warehouse, their faces triumphant. They carried a body, wrapped in a sheet, and placed it in the trunk of their car. They sped off, disappearing into the night. Alessandra lowered the binoculars, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She felt a wave of nausea, a mixture of relief and terror. Dario was dead. The plan had worked, but the danger was far from over. She waited for the signal, a prearranged phone call from Dario's contact within the police force. The call came an hour later, the voice on the other end confirming that the body had been identified as Dario Benedetti, that the police report had been filed, and that Ricardo was celebrating his victory. Alessandra took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. It was time for the next phase of the plan, their escape. She left the safe house, blending into the night, a ghost in a city that believed Dario Benedetti was dead. She met Dario at a prearranged location, a small, nondescript church on the outskirts of the city. He was there, waiting for her, his face hidden in the shadows. He looked different. He had shaved his head, altered his appearance, and adopted a new demeanor. He was no longer Dario Benedetti, the capo. He was someone else, a man reborn. Alessandra, he said, his voice a low whisper. You made it. She rushed into his arms, her body trembling with relief. Dario, she cried, her voice choked with emotion. Oh, Dario, I was so afraid. He held her tight, his embrace a haven, a promise of a new beginning. It's over, Alessandra, he said. It's finally over. We're free. They left the church, disappearing into the night, two shadows fleeing from the ghosts of the past. They drove to a small airport, where a private plane was waiting for them, ready to take them to a new life, a new country, a new beginning. As the plane took off, soaring above the city, Above the violence and betrayal that had defined their lives, Alessandra looked at Dario, her eyes filled with love and hope. The final confrontation had not been a battle of guns and blood, but a confrontation of hearts and loyalties. And they had won. They had chosen love over power, freedom over fear, and a future together over the chains of the past. And the best part, the most important part, was that they had chosen each other. Epilogue. 10 years later. The small cafe overlooked the turquoise waters of the Aegean Sea. The air was warm and fragrant, filled with the scent of bougainvillea and freshly brewed coffee. Alessandra, her hair now streaked with silver, sat at a table, watching the fishing boats bobbing gently in the harbor. She was no longer Alessandra Romano, the hostage, the pawn in a mafia power struggle. She was Elena Rossi, a woman who had built a new life, a new identity, in this quiet corner of the world. She sipped her coffee, her eyes scanning the crowd, searching for a familiar face. A moment later, he arrived. He was older, his hair completely silver now, his face lined with the passage of time, but his eyes, those intense, dark eyes, were the same. He was no longer Dario Benedetti, the capo, the man of violence. He was Marco Rossi, a man who had found peace, redemption, and a love that had endured the trials of a lifetime. He sat down opposite her, his smile warm and genuine. "Elena," he said, his voice a low rumble that still sent a shiver down her spine. "Marco," she replied, her voice filled with a love that had only deepened with time. They talked, sharing stories of their day, their lives, their quiet existence in this idyllic Greek village. They had built a small business, a bookstore and cafe, a place where locals and tourists gathered to share stories, to connect, to find solace in the written word. They had no children, but they had created a family of friends, neighbors, and fellow expats who had found refuge in this peaceful haven. They had built a life of simplicity, of honesty, of love, a life far removed from the violence and betrayal that had once defined their existence. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the sea, Marco reached across the table and took Elena's hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked, his voice low and serious. "Leaving everything behind? Starting over?" Elena looked at him, her eyes filled with a love that had only grown stronger with time. "Never," she said, her voice firm. "Not for a single moment. I found you, Marco, and that's all that matters." He smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "And I found you, Elena," he said. "And that's everything." They sat there, hand in hand, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, a silent testament to their enduring love, a love that had been forged in fire, a love that had survived the darkness, a love that had found peace in this quiet corner of the world. They had left their old lives behind completely. They had started over, and it had made all the difference. It was a happy ending, but it was not the end. It was just a new beginning.